All right, how's everybody doing today on a Red Monday here as we're getting ready to go for a Chiefs game tonight? Hope you guys had a nice weekend, enjoyed some rain. I certainly did. It was time for it. Also, a little information for you. Today's my son's birthday, so we've been celebrating that kind of all weekend. Pretty exciting to have a 9-year-old in the house. Anyway, today we're going to talk about some Renaissance art. I'm going to talk about a few of the artists and a few of their key pieces. I won't go over everything in detail. But there's a few things I do want to talk about to kind of give you an idea of sort of what Renaissance art was like and some of the key elements. So, first artist we'll talk about today, maybe, is Raphael. There we go. Raphael, Florence artist from Italy, so 1483 to 1520. He to me is one of the more interesting ones because he's sort of underrated, almost forgotten compared to Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo, mainly because he died. He was a young man. He died at age 37, whereas both Michelangelo and Leonardo lived well into their 60s and 70s. But anyway, we'll talk about him real quick. His most famous work is probably the School of Athens, or at least the most important. It is, I think, one of the high points of the entire Renaissance, in that it takes all of the Renaissance values we've talked about: humanism, secularism, classicism, individualism, and pulls them together by celebrating the classics, celebrating Greek life here, Greek discovery, Greek elements, these ancient leaders that were important to the world, and then created this beautiful painting. It's very large. If you see it, I have seen it. I've seen it. It's in the Vatican Library or museum, and it's breathtaking. It's a fresco, which means that it's a plaster with the paint basically painted into the plaster. So when the plaster dries, the paint dries with it, and it's a really cool piece of art. Maybe my favorite part about it is that this here, the model that was used here, is Michelangelo. So Michelangelo, the great artist of the day, is leaning on basically a block of marble. He's a great sculptor. He and Raphael had a little bit of a rivalry at this time, as Raphael considered himself the greatest painter and believed that he was, he should be doing all of the painting for the Vatican. But at this time is when Michelangelo had been basically picked to do the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. Raphael had done many paintings in the Sistine Chapel, in fact, along the lower half of the building, and was furious that Michelangelo had got that opportunity. But anyway, while these were both being painted, he had snuck in to see the Sistine Chapel, had seen the masterpiece that Michelangelo was painting, and as a tribute to him, put Michelangelo in his own painting. And not only did he do that, but he also put Michelangelo in his own style. Michelangelo's style is very wide and muscular. And so he basically painted Michelangelo as Michelangelo would have painted himself. You also have Leonardo da Vinci right here, the old man. He is playing the role of Plato. So you have in this Raphael here, Leonardo da Vinci here, and Michelangelo, your three probably greatest Renaissance artists of the time. Cool. This is the Marriage of the Virgin. This is another kind of great Raphael painting. A really good picture of the time, as it gives you these bright, vibrant colors, the bright reds, the bright blues, the bright greens, the yellows and golds that create contrast. You have this vanishing point in the background, really well framed picture here that became very much standard for the day. And one of the reasons why Michelangelo is considered one of the best of the time. This one is probably familiar to you guys. You've seen this one. It's basically the Assumption of the Virgin Mary as she is basically ascending to heaven. So Madonna and Child is here. But you probably recognize this from these little cherubs that you see on like greeting cards and things. So people have them in their houses. I had a couple of students a couple of years ago who reenacted it, which I always thought was kind of funny. Anyway, your next artist is Donatello. He was actually earlier in all of this, 1386 to 1466, another Italian Renaissance artist. He is famous for bringing back the sculptures. This is the bronze David, which he sculpted, which became the first freestanding bronze sculpture in some time. He becomes one of the people that inspire others to come along. Not real notable, other than a few things like this. Michelangelo is probably the most talented of all of the painters and sculptors of the time. As we've seen this one before, this is on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. It's called The Creation of Man. We talked about this the other day when you guys were looking at images, that this is basically a cross section of a brain as he is reaching into basically creating mankind. A lot of times you see just the images of basically the hand touching the hand, creating life. Here is the Sistine Chapel at depth. I've had the pleasure of seeing this. You kind of walk in through these doors and you just walk through and meander. The lower paintings here were done by Raphael, as I mentioned, but the ceiling here was done by Michelangelo, as was the painting at the back, The Last Judgment. It's an incredible place where the popes are chosen. It's an incredible site. Absolutely, incredible to go through and see. I hope everybody has the opportunity to do that someday. This is called The Last Judgment. This is one of the last things that Michelangelo did for the church, as it's basically sort of heaven and hell sort of thing, people going up to heaven and those who were basically doomed to damnation down here. Again, very powerful. As you saw on the previous slide, it is the back of the Sistine Chapel. But another kind of really cool work of art. Here's the ceiling, kind of, as you can see, all of it here. Each of these is a scene from the book of Genesis, but you have essentially this entire work here. Everything here is painted to, look as though it was architecturally designed. But it's an amazing thing. This is actually a relatively recent photo of it. In the last 10 years, they've done a huge restoration and cleaning of it because so much of the heating has been done over history with, wood and coal. It gave it a very kind of smoky look. They came through and cleaned it, so it gives you a pretty good look of what it would have looked like. There's the painting we saw earlier. This is probably my favorite Michelangelo work. This is called the Pieta. It's incredible. It's one of those that when you see it in person, you can't, possibly understand how talented he must have been to be able to essentially create the folds in the fabric and the muscle tone and veins out of and rib cages and all that stuff. As you think about like how this was all sculpted from a single piece of marble. It's very tall, actually. It's about 5-6 feet tall. Completely, again, as I said, carved. It's unique in that, this is, Mother of Christ looking down, but she's looking down. It's supposed to be the idea if she's looking down at her newborn child, but she's seeing what he is going to become someday. So young Mary looking down at full-grown Jesus, but a pretty powerful image. You can see here that his name is carved across here. The story as this goes, or at least the legend has it, that when this was unveiled in the Vatican for the first time, the people gasped because they could not comprehend its beauty. And they began immediately giving credit to other sculptors of the day. Michelangelo at the time was like 20 years old. And so he sculpts this, and yet nobody knows who he is. And so all these other people are getting credit for it that didn't do it. And he's furious. And so he basically that night goes in and carves his name across the chest. And one of the reasons why we have artists who now sign their names for credits because Michelangelo wanted credit for this work. So you have this amazing work, and then Michelangelo signs his name so everybody knows who did it. Probably his most famous work is the statue of David. This one's in Florence. It's like a 9-foot tall statue of what was supposed to be the perfect male form. But again, biblical, you have David standing there with this sling over his shoulder. Again, it's an amazing work of art. You can't imagine how tall and massive it is until you're there in person. Let's go back. Sorry. So the question I'll ask today, Joe, I want you guys to fill out in your focus question in the discussion is why was Leonardo da Vinci considered a Renaissance man? We talked a little bit about what Renaissance men was, the well-roundedness piece of what they were. So some of the things that he would have done to do this might be worth a Google. Give it a search, see if we can figure out all the things Leonardo da Vinci did, but we've mentioned a few of them. So da Vinci, 1452, 1519, again, probably the most famous. I think Michelangelo is the most talented. Leonardo is probably the most famous. His work, the Mona Lisa, is probably the most famous work of art ever completed. And one you've all seen. I've seen it. It's in the Louvre. It's beautiful. It's an interesting thing to see now. When I saw it, this was about 15, 16 years ago. actually 17 years ago, as we saw it when we were on our honeymoon. Um, it's kind of in a nondescript place. It's just a framed picture, but there's nothing else around it because people just line up to see it. And even, it's funny because this is before we had iPhones and cell phones. People were still like doing selfies and stuff in front of it so they could be seen. Um, it's so famous. I've even seen like Beyonce and Jay-Z take a selfie in front of it. Like, think about that, right? Like, that's how important it is. Anyway, it's significant. We talked about before because it doesn't necessarily, nobody really knows who she is. It's an excellent kind of example of humanism. It's not famous. She's not some sort of religious figure. It's just a portrait. And it's got an interesting perspective. The horizon on the right is lower than the horizon on the left. She has a smile on the right, but she's kind of looking down on the left. So you kind of have this kind of different sort of movement based upon the horizon in the background. Her hands are intricately painted. The colors are unique. It's even been stolen, so it's a fascinating painting. Another one that many of that you've seen before is the Last Supper. This one is in Milan. I have not seen this one, but this is a very famous one. Legend has it that this guy right here, Jesus, is the same guy here. It took him almost 7 years to complete this painting, and the idea was that actually he used the same model for Jesus as he did for. So I'm drawing a blank here for Judas. Sorry, there you go. But anyway, you can see this unique perspective, and many people have seen this before. It looks more like this when you see it in print. My grandma used to have this on her wall, but that's another one of his famous works. This is the Vitruvian Man. He was very much interested in perspective, how essentially people were drawn to make sure that everything was done accurately. Proportionality was really important, and so this is a sketch from his notebook that basically talks about how that looks. So next question, I've mentioned several. What pieces of Renaissance art have I seen in person? I think I've mentioned 6 maybe in this so far. So try to think of those. Our next artist is El Greco, 1547 to 1614. This is kind of talks about the spread of the Renaissance. He's called El Greco because he was Greek. He studied in Italy, but then began painting other places, mainly in Spain. This is called Toledo. This is a religious capital of Spain. And so this is the hills of Toledo, which is a very different look. But he's also a key Renaissance artist. I have not seen this one. Titian, another artist as they move a little bit later in the Renaissance. This is Adam and Eve, again, religious in topic, kind of the warmer colors and stuff that we've seen before. He also did this one, which is probably his most famous work, which is Ascension of Mary. You can see the various tiers of this, the bright colors, the contrast here. Pretty powerful imagery as you have Mary ascending to heaven. Rembrandt, the most famous of your Northern Renaissance painters, 1606 to 1669. You guys have probably seen this. The Northern Renaissance used much darker tones as you kind of go through. He did a series of self-portraits. This was the last one he did, but the artist became the star. He starts to do self-portraits when he's a young man and basically does several of them until shortly before he dies. Van Eyck, we've already seen one of Van Eyck's paintings. We've seen the marriage here that we talked about, how unique this one is because it's just, weird. But anyway, but you can see kind of a snapshot of life. You have this kind of real life. It's not staged. You have, the dog is in the picture. You have his shoes. You have tangerines in the background. The artist himself, you can see in the mirror, right? You have all kinds of stuff going on here. That gives you this kind of imagery of what it would have been like to be in the Netherlands at this point in time, or what was called Flanders at the time. He also did this sort of famous picture you've seen. You've got the angel over the shoulder here. You have the Pope basically blessing the child. The child's actually blessing the Pope because it's, Mary and Jesus. So anyway, you kind of have this different look. But again, his style was very detailed, very realistic. So that's kind of it. We'll stop there for today as far as those images go. But I wanted you to kind of just see a few of the artists. make sure you answer those 2 questions I put in the discussion, and I'll see you guys in class tomorrow.